North Africa, in many respects, Morocco and Northwest Africa is what I have in mind here. It really could be Western. So it is, in the simplistic term, it is to the west of much of the West. It was historically Christian. Saints Augustine and Monica, Perpetua, Felicity, Tertullian was from, they were all from Northwest Africa. It has a long history of constant contact with what we term the West, and with even the United States. It was the first country to recognize the independent United States. So there's a long history of engagement. It even shares Roman heritage. One of the most popular tourist destinations to this day is Volubilis, Welidi, where you can just wander amidst these beautiful Greco-Roman ruins, seeing mosaics and colonnades, and seeing the West in its history in Africa. And yet, those tourists who are wandering amidst the colonnades and amidst the ruins are there in part because there is something distinct, that this is such a marked contrast with the neighboring cities of Fez and Meknes, with their beautiful riads and palaces and labyrinthine souks and mosques. So I suppose at this point the question is valid. Why is Islamic civilization different from the West? In what respects? And I'm interested in why is it different? So I, in my agonizing despair over answering this in 15 minutes, came most consistently up with liberalism, that both philosophical and political liberalism is probably the most consistent marker between the West and Islam. And of course, this really only kicks the can just a little bit further down the road, because why did liberalism emerge in the West and not really in Islam? Of course, there are, especially more recent, 19th to some extent, 20th century, a little bit of 21st century strands of liberalism in Islamic thought, but it emerged in the West, it flourished in the West, it is marked in the West. Josh Mitchell has argued in a book called Tocqueville in Arabia, based largely on his experiences teaching in Qatar, where I also taught, and in Iraq. He's argued that the Arab world resembles the aristocratic world that Tocqueville was discussing in Democracy in America, and that this is part of the reason for these inter-civilizational conflicts, is that we in the modern democratic egalitarian West don't understand the aristocratic world out of which we emerged, especially Americans don't understand it. I think we could transfer that argument somewhat to more or less, to the Islamic civilization that I'm discussing, though of course this would vary depending on whether we're talking about Arab or Persian or Turkic or Malay subdivisions. Still, I'm largely discussing the Arab world, and I'm largely discussing Sunni Islam, though I'll try to make some distinctions along the way. So again, but even if we accept that, why? Why did liberalism emerge in the West? And I'm going to just have to stick to a few observations, both because of time and certainly because of limited expertise. But there are two aspects of liberalism I want to discuss that make sense in the context of Christianity and Judaism that don't make as much sense in the context of Islam and its history, though I argue that it could have gone differently in both cases. So the two facets of liberalism are the separation of religion and state and individualism. And both of these rely on some prior values. So first, on the separation of religion and state, this I trace to an affirmation of human reason over and above, or at least on some sort of equal par with revelation. And that paradoxically required a harmonizing of religion and reason, such that you could actually, you don't have to subordinate one to the other. They need to be able to work together so that you can separate them. So a bit of Islamic theological and philosophical history, although Professor Huff thankfully has given us a good deal of the translation movement, so I can skip that part. But the Greco-Arab translation movement of the 8th through the 10th centuries, especially in the East, in Basra and Baghdad, translated what was, at the time, pretty much the entire known corpus of Greek scientific and philosophical thought. So this goes against, of course, any notion of the ignorant Islamic world. I think not coincidentally at the same time, the dominant theological school in the Arab Islamic world was the Mu'tazili school, which was highly rationalist, not Enlightenment as we think about it, but deeply rationalist and concerned with a lot of the same questions that Christian theologians have dealt with in the West throughout history. Relationship between revelation and reason, whether God can command something unjust, which I think is a big one, whether God is bound by his own nature and bound by his own word or not, the nature of the revelation, in this case, whether the Quran was created or uncreated. If it's uncreated, it cannot be otherwise. If it's created, it is open for interpretation. Whether humans have free will. This was a big one. For the Mu'tazili, humans have to have free will. If they do not, God's justice is actually called into question. For reasons historical, political, and possibly religious, the Mu'tazili school, theological school, eventually was taken over by the Ash'ari theological school. And while that downplayed the use of reason, it certainly didn't eliminate it, but it did set Islamic theology on something of a path that would eventually, I think, diverge with the history of revelation and reason in the West. So if you think of the last great debate between a Mu'tazili and an Ash'ari, it would probably be Ghazali's The Incoherence of the Philosophers, and then Averroes' somewhat cheeky response, The Incoherence of the Incoherence. And while, if you read the two, I don't know that Ghazali is just so persuasive that he wins, but the forces of history and philosophy were already somewhat on his side. So again, we probably don't have time to get into the nitty-gritty of how that transition happened. But I would say that had things gone otherwise, had Averroes carried the day, there may have been the synthesis that we see in Christianity and largely Thomas Aquinas, in Judaism, in Maimonides, but they didn't. So this effort to harmonize, to synthesize revelation and reason, and that would lead to a separation of church and state, was not completed and in fact turned away. So the second aspect then that I want to move on to, the second aspect of liberalism, that of individualism, this is probably the more controversial element. This aspect of liberalism too has a prior virtue or a prior philosophical aspect to it, that of the equality of all humans. If we are not all equal, then subordination and hierarchy would be necessary. If we're going to acknowledge that humans are not all equal, certainly we need to submit to the stronger or the wiser or what have you, or to the more valuable, I should say. So Nietzsche will be our guide here, and this is, again, the more controversial part, but I think that there is some strong evidence to back it up. Nietzsche's well-known critique of Christianity and the genealogy of morals, the inter alia, focuses on the inversion of values, right? If we think of condemning the lamb and exalting the bird of prey, in a sense, or saying at least, we can't blame the bird of prey for preying on the lamb. The strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must, right? We cannot blame them for this. This is acting according to nature. It is the deed that must be done. So I think that this critique is accurate. Certainly if we look at Christianity and the Beatitudes, blessed are the weak, of turning the other cheek. I mean, we see this throughout Christianity. We see in Judaism, I think, the value of suffering, right? A religion that begins in its formative years, that has wandering through the desert, slavery, all kinds of disasters. These Judaism and Christianity and Western civilization have theological roots for protecting the weak, for acknowledging the worth of individuals, regardless of strength. Islam, in its history, started out so differently. And this point is not original to me, but if you look at the first 100 years or so of Islamic expansion, it was phenomenally successful. It was the largest pre-modern empire, I'm told, ever defeated and done so rapidly and done in the name of religion. So I think one could be forgiven for seeing in this, well, the hand of God is upon Muhammad, right? He is the final prophet. This is the true religion. As another, like, for instance, a mark of the true caliph is that he'll never lose ground. So the virtue of suffering, the exaltation of the weak, it's it's not there so much. So what we see instead is the virtue of expansion. It is an improvement for a society to submit to Islam. It is an improvement for them. It is a mark of victory for Islam. This is in the early days. And I want to make it clear that I'm not making this blanket statement about Muslims, but that theologically, the idea of equality was just not quite as present. So, given the value then placed on triumph, on strength, as well as given the universalizing nature of Islam, combined with its always political and religious nature, Christianity separates, in its founder, Christianity separates religion and politics. Judaism combines them but is not universalizing, whereas Islam is universalizing as well as always political and religious. So it is difficult to see that the idea of the equality of all people would come out of this as a necessary historical development. Rather, there's a greatness to Islam, a virtue in submitting to it that doesn't entirely square with the equality that underlies liberalism. But here we probably arrive at liberalism's two-edged sword. As I was composing this talk, it came across as rather, to me anyway, it came across as rather negative towards Islam, which wasn't actually at all my intention, probably because I think there is and ought to be some ambivalence out there towards liberalism, towards what Tocqueville described as a sort of ever-increasing march towards equality, right? So, as I hope I've made clear, it would be a caricature to try to describe Islam as the defeating civilization and the West as the one of protecting the individual. The very liberalism that I'm identifying as this key difference may well contain within itself the seed of its own destruction. Contemporary Islamic critiques of Western culture and civilization, I think, are not off point. Excessive individualism, excessive consumerism, secularism, a loss of tradition. And while, of course, the counterparts to all of those, free markets, church-state separation, individual freedoms, all have enormous merit, they also have enormous potential for excess. So the same illiberalism that may be making democracy elusive in in many Muslim-majority countries, not all, that has also probably retained family integrity, respect for tradition and history that are lacking in our own contemporary culture. We see fertility rates plummeting in the West. We see them thriving in a lot of Islamic cultures. And Nietzsche's voice echoes a bit in the background, asking whether this ethic of ressentiment can actually sustain a civilization. So I suppose I would end here, as I think I'm getting down to the wire, with a play off of tonight's keynote address, The Art of Western Civilization, rather than Democracy, Christianity, and Individuality. I would say the art of Western civilization, liberalism, rationalism, and equality, for better and for worse. So, thank you very much.